So this video is on chapter 2 of your textbook, Securing and Searching the Crime Scene. The objectives are to provide a general overview of securing and searching the crime scene, demonstrate the importance of meticulous documentation, emphasize the need for careful collection of crime scene evidence, and give examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The critical people at a crime scene are the first responders and the police investigator. They're different roles. First responders do not process the crime scene. Their three responsibilities are to secure the crime scene, coordinate the deployment of additional responders, and collect basic information. So securing the crime scene, they're going to preserve the scene and minimize the disturbance and or contamination of physical evidence. They'll ensure and maintain a safe environment for officers and other individuals. The role of the initial responding officer is very critical to solving the crime, solving and prosecuting the crime. The initial responding officer's role, like I said, is not to process the crime scene. I think I already said this already, but the three basic goals of the initial responding officer is to bring the site under control. That means make sure it's safe. You know, there's nothing like going to explode or whatever, and preserve the evidence. The second goal is to coordinate the deployment of appropriate and available resources. So does the scene require decontamination, you know, if it has unsafe chemicals? Utilities need to be shut down if like there's electricity kind of open cables. Specialized assistance like medical assistance, fire department, animal control, etc. Also, the initial responding officer needs to exclude unauthorized personnel and keep logs of anyone entering and exiting the crime scene. So they have to keep very, very good documentation of that. So the first responders collect basic information. They don't just, like you see on TV, burst in and do stuff. The officer's safety is critical. Make sure everyone's safe, and documentation must begin immediately. So they log dispatch information. So they have to log the location, the date and time, the call type, and any parties that were involved. They have to be aware and make a note of persons or vehicles leaving the scene and approach the scene cautiously, scanning the entire area and note any possible secondary scenes. And be aware of persons, vehicle, or vehicles that may be related to the crime. So in this image here, the murder suspect, Dario Ormajust, was caught outside of his home smoking as his brother and father lay dead in the house. So, you know, the first responder, I'm sure, would make a note who was hanging around the house. Make sure you document the people there. First responders identify and control dangerous situations and people. They look, listen, and smell to assess the scene. Assume the crime is ongoing, remain alert and attentive. Treat the location as a crime scene until it is determined otherwise. Safely direct other responders into the area, also logging who is going into or out of the area. Priority is to ensure the safety of officers and others. So any kind of threats at the crime scene could be biological, chemical, radiological, electrical, fire explosives, etc. The appropriate personnel or agency must be contacted prior to entering the scene if you have any of those special cases. You want to reduce the risk of harm to officers and maximize the safety of victims, witnesses, and others at the scene. And notify supervisors or call for appropriate assistance. All that is super important. Emergency care. After controlling any dangerous situations or persons, you want to provide emergency care for injured victims. So first, make sure the situation is controlled and then provide emergency care for any injured victims. Life-saving takes priority. So an officer accompanies the victim or suspect to the medical facility, and he would, on his way, document any statements or comments that the victim, suspects, or witnesses might make. The officer also preserves any evidence on the way to the hospital or whatever, and safeguard the evidence taken into custody. And also, he has to follow the chain of custody procedures immediately. So any piece of evidence, you have to know and have control of it every minute since you've identified that piece of evidence. You want to limit the number of individuals entering the scene. So identify all at the scene, all the people at the scene, suspects, victims, and witnesses, and keep them separate so they're not commingling and they're not like talking to each other about what may or may not have happened. So you want to keep the different individuals separate. Control the family and friends with compassion, but you do keep them in control. Law enforcement, medical, and others should assist. You have to keep an eye for family pets or wildlife. And definitely exclude unauthorized personnel such as media or bystanders. If they're not specifically a witness, they should be removed from the scene. And this image here, I put this one here, it's of JonBenét Ramsey's house in Boulder, Colorado. I don't think I was living in Denver at the time that this happened, but I do remember hearing about it. And if you read the little article in chapter 2, you know that after JonBenét, after they realized there was a crime, the police let the neighbors come over, friends, the family were all together, the father and a friend were like walking all over the house. All that should not have happened, and it very much complicated, the investigating the case afterwards. The responding officer establishes the boundaries also. So you start at the primary focal point and extend outward. So where did the crime occur? And you want to extend outward from that. You determine possible points and pathways of entry and exit of the suspects or witnesses. The areas where the victim or evidence may have been moved are secondary scenes. Kind of try to see if you can figure out if there is a secondary scene. You want to kind of identify and extra protect any trace or impression evidence because they can be lost pretty easily. Physically secure the boundaries with crime scene tape or ropes or cones, vehicles, personnel, existing boundaries, doors, walls, gates. So you want to somehow cordon it off so people are aware that they're not supposed to just walk through the area. You want to restrict access to the crime scene by posting guards. Also maintain a detailed log of traffic who comes in and out of the crime scene. You should get the personnel names, their ID numbers, shield numbers, time of entry or exit. Are there house pets loose on the scene? Make sure that those things are restricted as well. And initiate an entry control log. That's essential for maintaining the crime scene integrity. The initial responding officer briefs the investigators taking charge of the scene. So once the initial officer kind of like identifies the scene and kind of bounds it off, they would definitely call their supervisor or the lead investigator to come, and then he or she would brief the investigator taking charge of the scene. They'll turn over the responsibility for documenting traffic, meaning people coming and going to and from the scene. They will communicate the scope and nature of the scenes, and if there's a primary or secondary scene, whether the lights were on or off, the shades up and down, doors and windows are open or closed. All these details will be communicated to the investigating officer. And they should have been noted, hopefully, by the first responder after he secured the scene. Actions or alterations that have happened should be noted. The status of involved parties should be documented. The status of security and what is still needed, if applicable, should be documented. The first responder should remain at the scene until he or she is dismissed. So in summary, the first responder is very, very important to the integrity of the crime scene. And their duties are to preserve and protect the area. Their first priority is to obtain medical assistance for individuals in need. They ensure the safety of other responding officers and other personnel. They exclude all unauthorized personnel from the scene and keep an accurate log of who enters and exits and what time they do so. Now let's talk about the lead investigator responsibility. So once the crime scene is secured, the lead investigator will come in. Their responsibilities are to do an initial walkthrough of the crime scene, kind of get the lay of the land, to plan for resources. What do they need to process the crime scene? What experts, what kind of special personnel might be needed. They will talk to witnesses. They will search the crime scene for evidence, record the scene and collect evidence. That's very important. And then finally do a final walkthrough and cleanup of the crime scene. The initial walkthrough or initial overview of the crime scene, they will try to do it without disturbing the evidence. And this is to verify the scene boundaries and initial observations. So, it's another look, make sure that we got the boundaries correct. They really try to focus on the perpetrator's point of entry and exit. Verify the primary focal point, which is the indirect path taken to the center of the crime scene. Locate and document obvious evidence items. So one of your need to know questions was, how do you know, what is evidence? Some of it might be obvious, so they locate and document obvious evidence items. And they will also use markers, because you've seen that often in crime scene TV shows. They use markers, and they have to log every single piece of evidence. They take particular care with fragile evidence, such as tire or shoe impressions, prints, body fluids in snow. Those things can, get washed away or go away quickly. So you want to do that right away. These things are prioritized for photography, casting, and or collecting, depending on what the evidence is. So the walkthrough continued. You record the conditions of the scene and take special attention to items or conditions that suggest timing of the incident or do not appear to be long. For example, newspapers, what are the dates on the newspapers and mail? Is the coffee still warm? What is the temperature of the vehicle hood? Like, is it still hot? Is food out and spoiled, or does it look fresh? So what kind of scene is it? A primary or secondary, inside or outside? All these details are documented and recorded. The lead investigator is also in charge of planning. So he or she further isolates and protects the scene, determines if it's a single level containment, that is initial scene barrier perimeter area where the crime took place. The multi-level or a multi-level containment where there's, an inner scene where the actual crime took place and a working area surrounding the inner scene where other support officers may enter, staging of equipment and evidence is stored. The outer area also needs to be protected so that, from rubberneckers or media, etc. You want to kind of protect that. The lead investigator might also establish a command center outside of the scene boundaries so as not to, interfere with anything in the crime scene. And the goal of the command center is to coordinate the investigation activities. So this is where the investigators receive their assigned tasks from the lead investigator. So you would also, from the command center, notify dispatch of all contact information. You'd store equipment there. It's also a hub for coordinating all key investigative participants and activities. such as a place where media can get information. Investigators meet there to discuss aspects of the crime scene, and investigators and law enforcement personnel communicate with personnel at other connected crime scenes from the command center. So it's basically exactly what it says, a command center for all the communications. The lead investigator must identify, secure, and question witnesses at the scene, victims and suspects also. I think that's backwards. They keep the witnesses separate before, during transport, and during interview. Written and or recorded statements are taken. Documents, names, times, arrival, and departure information is taken from witnesses, victims, and suspects. Sorry about that. Weird. You also need to, as we said earlier, document the names and times of arrival and departure of all the authorized personnel who are at a crime scene, which includes the initial responder, medical personnel, ME or coroner, agency personnel, supervisors. You should include their ID and shield numbers and also the reason for being at the scene. So the lead investigator is responsible for, in summary, developing a strategy for the systematic examination and documentation of the crime scene. So they decide how you're going to process the crime scene. Gain an overview of the general setting, noting in particular objects do not appear to belong, or aspects of the scene that suggest timing of the incident. The presence or absence of evidence suggesting whether the scene is the primary or the secondary scene, and establish a command center where team receives assignments, stores equipment, collaborates about the case, and communicates with personnel at other crime scenes. Right, the next section that we're going to talk about is searching the crime scene. So you might take a look at this slideshow and make yourself a little cheat sheet or organize it in a way so that you can more clearly in your mind be able to determine what kind of search pattern you would use under different conditions. Okay, so whether it's outdoors, indoors, a big space that's complicated, or a small space, all these aspects will help you determine what is the better search pattern to use. Okay, so we'll just go through the different search patterns. So the line or strip search pattern is used when there's only one or two investigators. There's a large scene, so for example, if it's outside, and it has clearly defined edges, such as a field or a parking lot or a large room, right? So it's clearly defined edges. Okay, so that's when you do a line, oops, let me go back here, line search. So then you just kind of go in a line. The spacing of searches is indicated by these like lines here, and you just kind of go through and line by line, go through the whole area. All right. The grid search pattern is used when there are two or more investigators. They're typically used with 1 to 2 officers, probably more than 2 officers. Clearly defined edges such as a field, parking lot, or larger room. And it's more effective than a line or a strip search, because if you look at this pattern, right, one person is going to go this way horizontally, back and forth, which is almost like the line strip pattern. And then they're going to curve around and then go up and down, up and down. So you really get kind of a two views at the area rather than just a one time through. So it's generally more effective than a line strip search. A spiral pattern is used typically when there's a single investigator. The spiral path is from the center of the crime scene to the outward boundary. You start at the boundary of the crime scene to the center. Oh, there's another way to do it. You could start at the boundary and go into the center. And this is typically used when there's a single investigator searching and an undefined crime scene area like a forest or open field. So let's say you're doing it from the center where the crime occurred is right here in the center. Then you'd spiral out and search for any evidence as you're spiraling out. Or if you chose to do it differently, you could start from like the outer edge and spiral in. The wheel or ray search pattern is used when there's many investigators and you start from the center or the crime scene, right? And then you would walk in straight lines outward. And this is used when there's no large fields with no defined boundaries. So that's an example of that. Here's another example. Like, look at this. It's out in the middle of nowhere. So the investigators would start at the crime and walk outward. A quadrant or zone search pattern is used when the crime scene is divided into you divide the crime scene into smaller sections or zones. So, here's the crime scene. You're going to divide it into smaller sections. One or more investigators are assigned to each zone. This is used for a complex or large search area and helps prevent investigators from stepping on evidence such as pools of blood or areas of highly concentrated evidence. Probably, I'm guessing it would use like in a house or something like that when there's a lot of evidence. Or outdoors where there's a tremendous amount of evidence scattered everywhere, looks like. This is multi-tiered. You have not only, you got to think three-dimensionally in this one. You have not only evidence on the floor, but evidence was flung up onto the second tier here. And they use the quadrant or zone search pattern. So each team has been assigned a particular rectangle to search in depth. Okay, so searching a car is kind of a special subset of searching a crime scene. And investigators search the interior and the exterior of the vehicle. The vehicle may be searched at the crime scene or at the police department or crime laboratory garage. And the search type that they use is a modification of a zone search because it is a very kind of small and contained area. Night searches, investigators avoid carrying out outdoor or dark indoor crime scene searches at night. You just can't see as well. However, if there is changeable labile or evidence that could change easily, that must be collected immediately. They might have to do at least part of their search in less than ideal conditions. If possible, the crime scene is secured and guarded until morning. So evidence collection, the lead investigator decides what evidence is important, and they determine what evidence is collected. They review the evidence documentation, inventory, tags, notes, etc. They discuss preliminary scene findings. They discuss potential forensic evidence testing and prioritization. And they close out any open issues identified by the debriefing team and brief the upper person in charge. Somebody asked, how do you determine what is evidence? Well, there's some things that are relatively obvious. So in a homicide, you want to locate the weapon and any evidence that you might find that comes from contact between the victim and the assailant, like clothes and stuff like that. Cross transfer of evidence such as hairs, fiber, and blood. And the body and the surrounding area around the body, you want to collect evidence from there. For a burglary, you might want to look for tool marks at the point of entry, any latent fingerprints, that's fingerprints that you can't see with the naked eye. The evidence has to be recorded, both the location, the sketches of the location, photographs, mark the location with evidence marker at the scene. Once all of the evidence is identified and collected, A final walkthrough is undertaken to visually review the scene and collect all evidence and equipment. Ensure that all equipment, evidence, dangerous materials, etc. have been removed. The investigator might bring in the prosecutor assigned to the case to do a final walkthrough. I think just to give the prosecutor like an idea of what the area is. Following the final survey, the crime scene is released to the proper authorities, and all the barriers like the crime scene tape or any cones and stuff like that are removed. Final survey of the scene is a visual overview of all parts of the scene, an inventory of the evidence collected, retrieve all equipment, and confirm the safety at the scene. Then release the scene to proper authorities. So pretty straightforward.